What does a simple spilled coffee in a grocery store have to do with the very foundations of our legal system? Well, it turns out a whole lot more than you might think. Today, we're going to unpack the single most important concept that courts use to figure out who's to blame when things go wrong. I mean, it seems pretty simple, right? Someone slips, they fall, somebody's got to be at fault. But here's the thing, the law doesn't really work on gut feelings. Nope, it has a specific and actually kind of elegant framework to untangle exactly this kind of mess. Yeah, because what looks like just a simple, unfortunate accident on the surface is actually a really complex question of responsibility. And to answer it, the legal system has this amazing tool, and it's surprisingly simple, actually, that just cuts right through all the confusion. And it all boils down to this one core question. What would a reasonably careful person have done? See, it's not about what the store manager personally thought was okay, or what you or I might have done in that moment. It's all about a shared community standard of what's considered, well, careful. So, this whole idea of a reasonable person, it isn't just some philosophical guide or a vague concept. No, it's a formal legal tool. So, what do we actually call this thing? Well, it's called the standard of care. Okay, so here's the official textbook definition. And I know, it sounds a bit formal, right? Prudence and caution. But trust me, the core idea is super simple. Let's break down what that actually means in the real world. Probably the easiest way to think about it is like this. It's basically a legal measuring stick for our actions. It's the ruler the law uses to measure what someone did against that reasonable person standard. So, did their conduct meet the line or did it fall short? The standard of care is that line the law draws between just an unfortunate accident and actual provable negligence. So, how does a court actually use this measuring stick? I mean, it's not just a gut feeling, right? There's a clear four-part test they apply to pretty much every situation to figure out what was reasonable. So let's break it down. All right, here they are. The probability of harm, the seriousness of harm, the burden of precautions, and the social utility of the act. You can see right away it's a balancing act, right? It's all about weighing the potential for something bad to happen against what it would take to stop it. Let's dive into each one. Okay, first up, the probability of harm. Basically, how likely was it that someone could get hurt? Think about it. A tiny little puddle in some deserted corner, the chance of someone slipping is probably pretty low. But a huge spill right at the main entrance during the 5 o'clock rush, whoa, the probability of harm just went through the roof, and so does the expectation for the store to do something about it. Next, you have to ask, the seriousness of harm. If something did happen, how bad could it be? Slipping on a flat floor might just mean a bruised ego and maybe a little embarrassment. But a wet spot at the very top of a marble staircase, the potential for a really, really serious injury is dramatically higher, and that raises the standard of care way up. All right, now let's look at the other side of the equation, the burden of precautions. How difficult or expensive was it to prevent the harm? I mean, putting up one of those yellow wet floor signs, it costs next to nothing and takes, 2 seconds? And that is an absolutely crucial point. When a precaution is that cheap and that easy, the law almost always expects you to take it. No excuses. And finally, we have the social utility of the act. This is where the law asks, was the risky activity actually beneficial to society? The classic example here is an ambulance speeding to an emergency. Of course it's risky, but the benefit to society, saving a life, is way, way higher. A puddle in a grocery store, on the other hand, that has zero social benefit. It's all risk and absolutely no reward. And this is where it all comes together. It is literally a balancing act. On one side of the scale, you have the risk. That's the probability and the seriousness of the harm combined. And on the other side, you have the cost of prevention, so the burden of taking precautions, plus any social utility you'd lose. And if that risk side of the scale far outweighs the cost side, well, you've almost certainly failed to meet the standard of care. Okay, so now that we know what courts do look at, it's just as important to understand what they are trained to completely ignore. And honestly, this is what makes the reasonable person standard so powerful and so objective. The law just flat out doesn't care if you're a billionaire or if you're broke. It doesn't care about your job, your medical history, or if you've got a perfect reputation. Were you having a bad day? Doesn't matter. Your personal circumstances, whatever they are, do not change the objective standard of what a reasonably careful person would have done. Period. And the really amazing thing is, once you get this legal framework, you start seeing it everywhere. Seriously, This isn't just for lawyers and courtrooms. It's a mental model that all of us use, whether we realize it or not, every single day. Okay, so let's go back and solve our opening mystery. With our shopper, a court would weigh the super high probability of a slip in a busy aisle against the ridiculously low burden of just putting up a sign. When you look at that balance, a store that did nothing, yeah, they were almost certainly not being reasonably careful. And this quote just nails it, doesn't it? The law of negligence is not a law of prevention, but a law of reasonable conduct. The system doesn't demand that we're all perfect all the time. It just asks us to be, well, reasonable, to do that quick little balancing act in our heads before we act, or maybe before we fail to act. So the next time you see a wet floor sign, or you go back and double check that the stove is off, you are literally running this exact legal test in your head. It's true. So now that you know the framework, think about it. Where else do you see this balancing act happening? When you're driving in traffic? At your workplace? I guarantee, the more you look for it, the more you are going to find it.